Well, welcome, and to some of you, welcome again to the Catholic Intellectual Tradition Symposium. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tim Gabrielli. I serve as Gudorf Chair in Catholic Intellectual Traditions, and along with my esteemed colleague, Dr. Sandra Yoakum, University Professor of Faith and Culture, we're thrilled to be sponsoring this two-day symposium with a variety of presentations from faculty, students, and staff related to Catholic Intellectual Traditions. Our next presenter is one of the winners of this year's McGrath Award. So I'd like to talk just a little bit about the McGrath Award before I turn things over to him. It's an award sponsored by my office and named in honor of UD alumnus Father Jack McGrath from the Society of Mary. Father McGrath was a dedicated teacher who celebrated and embodied Marianist education in the Catholic intellectual tradition. And his career that spanned nearly 60 years, he taught a variety of disciplines, including math and history and theology at the high school level. And in 1987, he began as a faculty member here in the Department of Religious Studies and founded the Forum on the Catholic Intellectual Tradition Today. So the award named in his honor recognizes students whose research in a CAP course demonstrates careful, deep, and creative engagement with thinkers' text and/or themes associated with the Catholic intellectual tradition. So having applied this past fall with work completed in a CAP course either in spring, summer, or fall of 2022, this year's recipients were selected from really a very strong pool of submitted research projects. So each recipient receives a $500 award along with a special medallion. And if you were here earlier, you may have heard me mention on the front of this medallion, there's a little replica or an image of Mary's Seat of Wisdom, a particular version of Mary's Seat of Wisdom that was dear to Father McGrath, and it has been passed on to Dr. Yoakum. We think that Father McGrath received this in the 1970s in Rome at a international gathering of Marianists. So it's dear to Father McGrath, but also it's Mary's Seat of Wisdom, which is an ancient title for Mary, with Jesus sitting on her lap. And I think it reminds all of us in Marianist education that the pursuit of wisdom is ultimately an encounter with the transcendent, an encounter with God. So without further ado, let me introduce our next presenter and McGrath Award winner. So his name is Daniel Napoli. Danny is a first-year student from Cleveland, Ohio, double majoring in English and adolescent and young adult education. His award-winning project was completed for the first-year core course, ASI 110, The Roots and Development of Western Culture in a Global Context, with Professor Elizabeth Mackey, who's with us this morning. His title is Good Things Come to Those Who Train. It's my honor, on behalf of the McGrath Award Committee, to present you, Danny, with the 2023 McGrath Award for Common Academic Program Research in Catholic Intellectual Traditions. Congratulations. Come on up. Let me get his slides up here, and we'll turn the show over to Danny.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much to Dr. Gabrielli and all of you for having me here. As Dr. Gabrielli mentioned, my name is Daniel Napoli. I'm a freshman here at UD, and I'm here to share with you all my research on the contemporary relevance of divine revelation as interpreted by medieval mystics. And I know this title is a bit of a mouthful, so I want to take a step back just to kind of get situated with the thinkers and works and the context that informs them. So we're going to be focusing on two giants of medieval thought today. On the left, we have Maimonides, a hugely influential Jewish scholar and philosopher who lived and worked during the 12th century Egypt. The work of his, which we'll be discussing today, is The Guide for the Perplexed, which, to very briefly summarize, details his interpretation of the Bible, which reconciles faith with increasingly conflicting and contradicting scientific discoveries, as well as outlines his approach to mystical experience of divine revelation, or intellectual perception, as we'll call it. On the right is an equally important Catholic thinker, Julian of Norwich, living about 2 centuries after Maimonides, but operating within a similar global context of the medieval world. And we'll be looking at her text, Revelation, the Divine Love, which was written during her time of seclusion as an anchoress in Norwich, England. And through this text, we'll be exploring similar themes of mysticism and divine revelation, but through the lens of Christianity. So now for some of the global context. The first of which I want to talk about is the Islamic translation movement. And due to the rapidly developing Islamist world's seemingly insatiable appetite for knowledge, they were able to designate translators to bring some of the works of philosophical giants of the Hellenistic world to their own. And this allows scholars like Maimonides to embrace and apply Aristotelian and Neoplatonic logic to their thinking. Second is Christendom, the rapid spread and domination of Christianity throughout the West, which organized and structured all aspects of medieval life, including the labor system, economy, law, and could be thought of as the glue holding the medieval world together. It isn't surprising then that with scientific discoveries seemingly discrediting many Christian teachings, the church would seek ways to either suppress or reconcile the two. And while Maimonides wasn't himself Christian, his solutions would nevertheless influence the way the church would respond to this threat to its institution. Finally, and while this is more specific to my research, the spread of Islamic mystical philosophy marked a very important shift in philosophical and religious thought of the medieval period. This spread is extremely important as it opens the door to questions about how do I know that God really exists? And mystical philosophy practiced by groups such as the Sufis emphasize the importance of a physical, direct experience with God. It is also important to realize that this philosophy did not discredit the importance of logic and rationality, and instead it saw both logic and physical connection as necessary for worship. From this comes a balance between philosophy and direct connection, which will influence both Maimonides and Julian's works. So now I want to briefly mention my goals for this project. My first goal for the presentation is to promote discussion surrounding key works of multiple faith practices while exploring their impact on Christian thought. And in doing so, keeping in mind that the development of these two religions, Judaism and Christianity, is not mutually exclusive. The works of influential thinkers such as Maimonides and Julian spread quickly and played a role in shaping both their own and other religions. Second, I'd like to reflect on the modern-day relevance of these seemingly medieval or antiquated religious writings and ideas. I believe that by realizing the relevance of these two works did not end with the shift from a medieval to a modern world, we can come to see history as something that Dr. Traunger helped me realize in one of his first core lectures. We can come to see history as a stream of time. And what I mean by this is that works such as these two we will discuss today are contingent and built off of ideas that came before them, and will continue to carry on this stream, shaping what comes after and what is still to come. So now I'd like to give a brief bio of the first medieval thinker we'll be talking about, Maimonides. So Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, commonly referred to as Maimonides or Rambam from his initials, was a hugely influential scholar and philosopher of Judaism. He was born in Cordoba, Spain, but due to the North African Almohad Caliphate's invasion of his hometown and denial of religious freedom, he and his family moved to Cairo, Egypt, where Maimonides wrote his two most influential works, the first of which is the Mishneh Torah. Through the Mishneh Torah, Maimonides offers an interpretation of the 613 written laws in the Torah. There was a great need for this written compilation because up until this point, interpretations were spread orally by rabbis. But after the Roman seizure of Jerusalem, there was a need for a consolidation of these interpretations, which Maimonides offered and contributes to his great influence. The second of which, though, contributed to his philosophical and rational approach to Judaism. And this is a text we'll be looking at today, The Guide for the Perplexed. Maimonides' philosophical and rational approach to Judaism was largely influenced by the works of Hellenistic philosophers such as Aristotle and Plotinus, the founder of Neoplatonism. And as I mentioned earlier, these ideas were able to come into contact with Maimonides through the Islamic translation movement. Now, I'll touch more closely on how these two thinkers influenced his philosophy, but in general, Neoplatonism and its impact on Maimonides means that Maimonides did not see God as a being in a human or physical form. Rather, he saw it as an essence, absolutely one, simple and immaterial, outside of our physical realm. And this essence emanates its intellect outward in decreasing values until what little is left of it reaches us here in the physical realm. We can see this heavily structured and ordered view of the divine inspired by Neoplatonism on the image on the right. So I'd like to briefly mention Maimonides' goals for his text, Guide for the Perplexed. So in his first line of the guide, Maimonides writes, quote, "This treatise has at its principal object to clarify the meaning of certain terms in the Bible." He believed that due to a mistaken literal interpretation of the Bible, much of its truths have become distorted, leading to this seeming contradiction between science and faith. So by correcting these common misconceptions in his text, he's able to get at his second goal, which is to prove that reason and religion can and do coexist. And finally, taking a more mystical approach to his interpretation of Judaism, Maimonides is able to instruct his worthy readers of how to perceive God's active intellect, or as it is referred to through Julian's text, divine revelation. Going back to Neoplatonism, Maimonides believes that through training, one can reach out and connect with God's active intellect that has been emanated from him. And once reached, this active intellect allows us to perceive God's truths and distinguish clearly between truth and falsehood in our own world. So now I'd like to get into the text and discuss how he actualizes these goals he sets out to achieve. So first we see Maimonides instructing his readers on how to properly read and interpret the Bible, with the goal of clarifying these common misconceptions that he said was a problem. Now, Maimonides argues that since the Bible is written in, quote, similes and riddles, it should be read figuratively. A figurative reading, he argues, can resolve conflicts between science and faith, and it can make divine revelation possible through the lens of reason. Now let's take a look at an example Maimonides gives of a common biblical misconception and how he proposes to resolve it. The quote that he proposes to resolve is from Genesis, a widely cited quote, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness." Now, he uses a figurative interpretation to suggest that the likeness which God speaks of here is an intellectual likeness rather than a physical one. If taken literally, this passage could suggest that God is a being in human form, an idea that Maimonides strongly rejects, as it would place limiting human characteristics on a supreme immaterial being. Therefore, Maimonides believed that Adam and Eve shared God's active intellect, which Maimonides is currently striving for. And as a result, they were able to distinguish between truth and falsity. They had no need for these moral questions over right and wrong. However, after the fall, or original sin as it is referred to in Christianity, Adam and Eve lost this ability and were plagued with questions of good versus evil, and felt the emotional stress of shame as a result. So now, as I mentioned earlier, a Neoplatonic worldview shaped his strive for intellectual perception. He thought that through philosophical training, one could reach an intellectual perfection, and this, combined with good moral behavior and observance of Jewish law, could lead to a sort of merging with this active intellect of God, which would allow one to perceive his truths. Now, I want to stress the word perceive because Maimonides purposely makes a distinction between perception and knowledge. He was a firm believer in human limitation and our incapability of articulating God's truths. If we could truly know God's truths, we would have some level of power over them. We can only perceive them with our senses, but not transfer them or articulate them. And I would like to touch on this elitist conception that Maimonides had of who can perceive these truths, because we'll see it contradicts with what Julian proposes later. He has an elitist perception, and because of this, he goes so far as to scatter and mix his instructions for reaching intellectual perception within his own work. Quote, "Lest we contravene the will of God, who caused the truth relating to the perception of him to be hidden from the vulgar crowd." Now, before I compare this work to Julian's Christian interpretation, I'd like to give a slightly more detailed bio of her life. So, born in 1342, Julian lived and worked during and slightly after a plague-ridden and devastated England. And she worked as an advisor, author, and anchoress. And in case you're not familiar with the term, anchoresses and anchorites live a life of religious recluse in order to seek a closer connection with God. And as an anchoress, because of her life in seclusion, Julian was able to operate outside of this typical supervision of male church officials and act as an advisor for women such as Marjorie Kemp, another English Christian mystic. Other than advising, Julian embraced her own authorship through writing surrounding mystical experiences and lived a life of contemplation to become as close as possible to God. And at the beginning of Revelations, Julian gives a brief look into what she strived to discover during her time as an anchoress. We see this in her quote, "I desired 3 gifts by the grace of God. The first was for an experience of Christ's passion, the second was for a bodily sickness, and the third was to receive, as a gift from God, 3 wounds." As we can see, her strive for this sort of physical, sensational connection and proof of God's existence harkens back to the mystical philosophy which influenced Maimonides as well. Now, Julian's goals for the text. Her first goal, as she heavily stresses, is to act as a mouthpiece for God, and by doing so, share his message with all who believe. Julian writes that she hopes the audience will soon forget her and will behold Jesus, who is teacher of all. The second goal, however, is one that can be placed on her work from a contemporary reading of it, which is to embrace her female authorship and make her voice be heard in a time when women's voices were largely dismissed. And evidence for this goal can be found in her astute awareness of her audience and the rhetorical strategies she uses to best appeal to this largely male audience, as well as her embracement of first-person pronouns, championing the experience as her own. And on the surface, these goals seem a little contradictory. On one hand, Julian attempts to distance herself from the message she is spreading in order to give credibility that it's coming from God. But at the same time, she must embrace her authorship within this patriarchal society to spread her message to those she wants to hear. This was a daunting challenge because of how common it was for the women's voices to be dismissed. But Julian finds a very interesting solution to this paradox by embracing her lack of authority to establish a certain level of closeness with God that she used to allow her voice to be heard across the world. Now for an analysis of Revelations. When we look at the Revelations text itself, we see almost immediately glaring contradictions between her and Maimonides' experiences with divine revelation. First, we see her reject Maimonides' elitist approach that he took to protecting the experience of divine revelation. This can be seen in her quote, "Truly the vision was not shown to me because God loves me more than the least soul that is in grace." This aligns with her goal of acting as a mouthpiece for God. She acts in accordance with what she thinks God would want, just as Maimonides, who thinks God purposely hid his truths from the vulgar crowd, scattered and mixed his truths in his guide. We see another contradiction in her line, quote, "I saw the red blood trickle from under the garland, hot, fresh, plentiful, and lifelike, just as I thought it would have done when the garland of thorns was thrust on his blessed head. So both God and man together suffered for me." The contradiction here lies in Julian's humanization of God, or in fancier terms, anthropomorphization. As previously explained, Maimonides rejects this. And we can see his stance fueled by the iconoclastic principle of Judaism, which rejects graven images. And there is, however, some common ground reached between the two thinkers. This comes in their agreement regarding human limitations that render us incapable of fully comprehending God's works. Julian writes about what she calls the ghostly sight, saying, "I may not and cannot show you the ghostly sight as openly or as fully as I would like." Despite Julian's goal of acting as a mouthpiece for God, there were some things she perceived that were simply a mystery. And it is exactly in this word perceived that the two find common ground. While she could perceive the ghostly sight through her senses, she was unable to transfer it to others despite her intentions. This is exactly what Maimonides argued. And this is also strongly reflected in her religious background, which, with part of the Holy Trinity being the mystery of the Holy Ghost, that there are some things that we can just not fully comprehend. Now, why does this matter? I'd like to start thinking on this question individually. Why these two thinkers? Why do they deserve this intense analysis and discussion? And I'd argue, going back to the metaphor of history being a stream of time, it is because of how strongly the current of their messages has floated down this stream. Maimonides can hardly be overlooked in discussions regarding the relationship of science and faith, even in our curricula today. His guide has influenced far beyond Judaism and is undoubtedly a topic of discussion within the Catholic intellectual tradition. Julian's relevance in our world today is no less impactful. Her advising and writing during times of isolation and in a global context of plague have resonated with so many people in our world today, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'd like to argue, however, something that Dr. Fine of UD's English department helped me to realize during his lecture on Julian, that her contemporary relevance lies, more importantly, in how she embraced her authorship and made her voice heard in a context when women's voices were largely dismissed. A context which, unfortunately, has also made its way along the stream of time to leave traces in our world today. I'd like to thank you all for your attention and Dr. Mackey for helping me along every step of this process. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Comments or questions for Danny?
Dr. Chandra.
So, this is going to seem like a very trivial question. I'm curious, do you have a preference for one or two? Do you resonate more with one or others?
I personally resonate more with Julian's philosophy that, especially in her goal of acting as a mouthpiece for God, I think that resonates with me deeply in that if you have some sort of revelation is profound and meaningful to you, I think it is our goal and duty as people to share it with others and to be open like Julian was for the betterment of the common good. So I'd say I resonate with Julian more in that sense. Does anyone else have any questions? Dr. Gabriel?
Danny, this was a spectacular job with some really difficult texts. Really, really impressive. I wonder if I have a kind of a hard question for you, so it's okay if you don't really know. But you were talking about when contrasting Julian and Maimonides that one of the things that you were supposing here was an iconoclastic impulse in the Jewish tradition. You mentioned that Maimonides sort of picks up on, right? The idea that the question of graven images and the golden tablets and things like that. I wonder is there perhaps another impulse in the Jewish tradition that Julian is drawing upon here, a deeper Jewish tradition? I'm thinking of, you mentioned the famous line from Genesis 1:26, in the image of God, and what Maimonides does with that, which is really, really right on, I think, in what he's doing. But, we have the second creation story, a God who walks in the garden, right, and who speaks directly to Adam and Eve. You even argue in Genesis 1 that there's a God who's speaking, which is a very kind of anthropomorphic thing to do, right? And so, do you see Julian as maybe picking up on those other strains in the Jewish tradition?
Yeah, I think so, certainly, because as you mentioned with the two different creation stories, you have the one that's more of an essence sort of ordering down and exactly what he wants, but with the other one which you mentioned, with God in a much more human form, kind of connecting to Adam and Eve, I think Julian could have certainly been influenced by that in her thinking and visualization, depiction of God in her own mind, and how he was represented in her divine revelations. I think certainly that those two different creation stories could influence both of them in different ways. I think that's a great thought, yeah. Well, thank you all so much again.